Welcome to the Thames Path near Thamesmead in London. A beautiful, if in some places kind of scummy, path along the River Thames. And I'm here today to talk about one of the worst inland boating disasters the UK has ever seen. In 1878, an incredible, horrifying and completely avoidable disaster happened on the Thames, roughly where I'm standing right now. And it resulted in the loss of hundreds of lives. This is the Princess Alice disaster. Tuesday, September the 3rd, 1878 was a beautiful day. And coming to the end of the summer cruise season, hundreds of Londoners were trying to take advantage of possibly one of the last glorious days of the year. Nearly 1,000 people were gathering at Old Swan Pier near London Bridge. This particular day cruise took its passengers all the way from London Bridge down to Sheerness and back again, all in the one day. And as smelly and horrible as the River Thames was during this particular period of time, and to be honest, it's not much better now, it was a nice break from the busy, dirty, smelly streets of London. And sitting at the edge of Old Swan Pier was the SS Princess Alice. The Princess Alice itself was a paddle steamer that was originally launched in 1865. She was about 67 metres long and 6.2 metres at its widest point. She was built up in Scotland, and in previous videos I've spoken about the history of steamers being produced up in Scotland and in Glasgow, and some of the other tragedies that occurred up there that involved steamers. And she carried passengers for the Weymouth Bay Railway Company up until 1867, when she was bought by Waterman's Steam Packet Company to travel on the River Thames. And it was at this point that she was given the name Princess Alice. In 1870, she was sold to the Woolwich Steam Packet Company, and it was at this point that she started operating as an excursion steamer. Now, looking at those measurements and looking at the pictures of the Princess Alice, she wasn't the biggest of boats, and originally during her lifetime, she'd only been licensed to carry less than 500 passengers. But in 1878, the year of this disaster, taking into account the fact that she was now operating on the River Thames, which was, something of a smooth water service compared to what she'd been doing previously, the Board of Trade upgraded her certificate and enabled her to carry up to 936 passengers. And as we're going to see, almost doubling her capacity may have contributed to what was about to happen later that same year. So back to the morning of the 3rd of September, the gates opened and the day trippers scrambled aboard in their hundreds. And as more and more passengers squeezed onto this small paddle steamer, it sank lower and lower in the water as the weight continued to increase. People were literally squeezed onto this boat like sardines. The captain of the vessel was a man named William Grinstead, who was an incredibly experienced sailor with over 20 years of experience sailing on the Thames. And as her whistle sounded, the engines kicked into gear and the Princess Alice started her journey down to Sheerness at about 11 AM. And thus began a beautiful day out that would end in unbelievable tragedy. During the journey, she stopped off at Blackwall, North Woolwich and Rocherville Gardens in Gravesend, which was where many of the passengers were going to disembark for a wonderful day at the pleasure gardens. And this is kind of how the trip worked. People could use their tickets interchangeably to kind of hop off wherever they wanted to along the route, and then jump back on as the Princess Alice worked its way home on the return journey. And Rocherville Gardens was something of the premier destination on the route. And, quick little aside, the entrance to Rocherville Pleasure Gardens is right here. Alright, now I know it doesn't look like much, but if we take a closer look, we'll see the remains of what used to be Rocherville Gardens. Just on the other side of this fence is the old tunnel entrance that was cut down through the cliff top to get down the cliff into the pleasure gardens. And the tunnel itself is actually still there beneath where I'm standing right now. And obviously it is slightly worse for wear now. And here behind me you can see just there the remains of some of the fancy architecture that surrounded this elaborate entrance. It's not quite the same today though, I'll tell you that. And interestingly, there's actually a couple of old statues and pieces of stoneware that were left over from the old entrance that were then moved into this new housing estate. But there is a very good chance that where I'm standing right now is where a lot of the victims of this disaster were earlier that day. Sorry to interrupt the video, this is just a quick reminder that if you're enjoying it so far, then hit that like button, hit that subscribe button for more content like this, and you will have my eternal gratitude. Alright, back to the video. So she dropped people off at Rocherville and then carried on down to Sheerness. And it was about 6:30 p.m. when the Princess Alice called back at Gravesend to pick up everyone who'd been enjoying the pleasure gardens. Now, once it had finished taking on passengers at Rocherville, we don't know exactly how many people were aboard, as at this point no passenger counts or lists were actually kept. So all we know is that she was still roughly at capacity. And once they were all aboard, she started the final 20-mile stretch back to London Bridge. And here, one potentially fateful decision was made. Captain Grinstead allowed his helmsman to stay at Gravesend, replacing him with someone called John Ayers, a seaman who was relatively new to the Princess Alice and to boating on the Thames. And as people on the shore waved them on their way, little did they know that that was the last time they would see many of them alive. The journey back into London was relatively calm, following the twisty, turny route until they reached a large bend in the Thames called Galleon's Reach. At around 7:40 p.m. that evening, the Princess Alice rounded this corner behind me. Now, this was a point that most experienced sailors knew that they had to be exceptionally careful. And before this particular day, there had been more than one serious collision on this bend. Now, up until this point, the current had been particularly strong in the centre of the Thames, and so the Princess Alice, when she was able, had been pretty much hugging the bank of the Thames to try and fight upstream. However, as the Princess Alice chugged around Galleon's Reach, she drifted into the middle of the river, which might not have been a problem if the river was empty at that time, but the Princess Alice and those on board were not that lucky. It's at this point that another ship, a much larger ship, came into view. As she veered off course, she veered straight into the path of the much larger vessel, the Bywell Castle, a huge cargo ship that was being used to transport coal. She was 78 metres long to the Princess Alice's 67, and she was 9.8 metres wide at her widest point to the Princess Alice's 6.2 metres. And where the Princess Alice displaced 432 tonnes, the Bywell Castle's gross registered tonnage was 1,376, meaning the Bywell Castle was moving a lot more weight through the water than the Princess Alice. The captain of the Bywell Castle was Thomas Harrison, who was relatively unfamiliar with the Thames, but he'd employed an experienced Thames pilot called Christopher Dix. Even though he was not actually obliged to do so, he could have just done it himself. So the Bywell Castle was in pretty safe hands. Now, at first, the passengers on the Princess Alice didn't think much of the Bywell Castle. They'd passed many other ships on their way up the Thames, and the Bywell Castle seemed like any other. They would just pass by, waving and cheering, and then they would carry on to North Woolwich Pier. And for many, this is what they did. People waved and shouted hello to the shadowy figures they could see up high on the Bywell Castle. The band continued playing, and the partying carried on in full force. What they couldn't see were the looks of fear on the faces of the experienced sailors stood up on the Bywell Castle. The first that pilot Christopher Dix saw of the Princess Alice was its red port light, seeming as though it was on a course to pass starboard of them. At this point, the Princess Alice was still trying to find the slack water, or the areas of water in a tidal river that aren't moving. Still trying to find that smoothest way upstream. The Bywell Castle was roughly in the middle of the river, and as she rounded Galleon's Reach, she saw the Princess Alice change course, bringing her straight into their path. At this point, it seemed that Captain Grinstead had seen the imminent collision, and he apparently shouted to the Bywell Castle,
"Where are you coming to? Oh, good God, where are you coming to?"
At this point, the Princess Alice was committed to its path, and although Dix did try to manoeuvre the Bywell Castle off of this inevitable collision course, there was little he could do but order the engines to be put into full reverse. But for both vessels coming round this blind bend straight into one another's path, it was just too late. And as the two vessels approached each other, people started to realise how much bigger the Bywell Castle was than the Princess Alice. At this point in its journey, it was not carrying any coal. It was destined to pick some up en route to Newcastle. And so compared with the Princess Alice, which was still carrying its huge number of passengers and sitting incredibly low in the water, the Bywell Castle was sitting much higher. And as they got closer and closer, it loomed larger and larger over the starboard bow of the Princess Alice. And then it happened.
I have no idea at the time the collision occurred, but it was dark. I had my brother-in-law with me. I was on the aft part of the paddle box. Up to this time we were all merry and lively and everything was nice. My first idea of danger was in hearing the captain shout out, "Hi, hi, where are you coming to?" The next thing, she seemed to squeeze into us, right amidship. There was no great shock. It was a thrusting in, and it seemed to crush her. There was a general cry to get out of the way of the bark, and the captain and the crew called out to those on board the other vessel to stop. In another moment the crash came, and they came right into us, striking us just beside the paddle box, and nearly cut the vessel in halves.
The sharp steel bow of the Bywell Castle cut into the side of the Princess Alice. She was struck on the starboard side just in front of her paddle box. The Bywell Castle plunged through her, right through her innards all the way to the engine room, essentially slicing her in two. And those unfortunate passengers that were caught in the immediate collision and didn't know anything about it were the lucky ones. Water immediately started to flood into the two gaping sides of the Princess Alice. The forward section of the vessel went down almost immediately, like a dead weight in the water. The aft section lifted slowly in the water until it was standing almost straight up, and then slid below the waves. The crew of the Bywell Castle, seeing that there wasn't anything else they could do to get out of the way, immediately started dropping ropes to try and help the survivors who were in the water. Their lifeboat was also launched, and they did manage to rescue 14 people. At the same time, boat crews who were nearby along the shore of the Thames saw what had happened and immediately tried to get over and help in any way they could. As this calamity took place, the scenes on board and inside the Princess Alice must have been nightmarish. There were 2 saloons below decks that were full of people, men, women and children, and a lot of them would have had not a lot of time to try and save themselves. There must have been a stampede of people trying to get out of the boat in any way they possibly could. And when you think of how they were all squeezed in like sardines, there was just no room to move, and it would have been a mass of hysterical, screaming bodies. Those on deck who hadn't been immediately forced into the water by the collision were still crammed together in an unbelievable mass of humanity. And a lot who may have tried to leap overboard if they could, simply couldn't get through the crowd to do it. The speed with which these people had gone from having an unbelievably nice time to fighting for their lives just cannot be overstated. All in all, it only took about 4 or 5 minutes for the Princess Alice to go down.
As she backed out and let water in, and we were all gone in less than 5 minutes. She went down in mass. Children were crying, women screaming for ropes or anything to get a hold of. In fact, I stood back resigned. I felt there was no earthly chance of getting before other people. I was saved by a boy from a boat that went over my head. I caught hold of it. For my own part, I do not believe there is 1/4 of the passengers saved. The shrieks were something indescribable. It was something terrible to see. 400 or 500 trying to get on one rope. Everybody on board knew she was going. There were bodies enough to be picked up, but the boatmen and everybody wanted to save those that were alive. The water was thick with them. It was a little boat that picked me up. They threw ropes over from the steamer, and they did throw boys over and saved me and 2 others. I then attempted to find my mother and aunt, not thinking the damage was so much as it really was. but I soon found all was over with us. Attempting to save myself, therefore, I caught hold of the chains of the other vessel, but was knocked off in the great crush. I, however, again attempted, and this time managed to climb up the side of the paddle box of our boat, and caught hold of the rail. No sooner had I done this, however, than she went down. I cannot swim very much, but I had the presence of mind to strike out a little, and thereby kept myself up, until I got hold of a piece of wood. After that I got hold of a form, and floated down the stream towards the screw. I then called out for a rope, which was held out to me after I had been in the water some 3 or 4 minutes. I ran to a young lady with whom I was keeping company, and took her on my shoulder, being a good swimmer, and jumped overboard and swam to the shore. But as I was going, my poor girl slipped off my shoulders, or was dragged off, and I lost her. I saw a gentleman who was sinking and caught hold of him and held him up till we were picked up.
Now, horrifyingly for these passengers, the collision happened not long after 75 million gallons of raw sewage had been dumped into the Thames. It is very difficult to imagine the smell. And the Thames isn't great now, but at least we're trying not to dump millions of gallons of raw sewage into it. But at the time, this was common practice, and most of our rubbish ended up in the river. But hundreds of people were about to find out exactly what being suddenly submerged in gallons of decomposing sewage was going to feel like. And those in the water, if they didn't already have this horrible sewage to deal with, they also couldn't swim. And on top of that, would have been dressed in heavy Victorian era clothing. That's big dresses, fine suits. They were on a lovely trip out as well, so they would have been dressed in their finest attire. And the vast numbers of those who were wearing heavy clothing and had no experience swimming sank almost immediately. And as for lifeboats, the Princess Alice carried only a few, and there wasn't even enough time to launch those. The speed with which this disaster took place, plus the number of people on board the vessel, meant that any safety measures aboard were useless. And there were several smaller tragedies in and amongst this one huge disaster. In its attempts to save people, the Bywell Castle's efforts also led to more death. Where they'd lowered ropes so that people could climb aboard, too many people tried, with people clambering over and above each other to try and get out of the water, and ultimately just dragging everybody back down. Some people in the water had also tried to climb onto the Bywell Castle's anchor chain, and it was covered in people hanging from the huge iron links. But after the Bywell Castle had come to a stop, it had begun to drift downstream, and those aboard, not necessarily realizing that people were on the anchor, were ordered to lower it. And as the huge anchor dropped and disappeared into the murky waters of the Thames, it dragged those who it had given safe harbour back down into the depths. I found a small path that comes closer to the water down here, but I also seem to have discovered the spot where people like to come and take a shit. I am surrounded by tissue paper and flies. Well, I suppose the one thing that standing in and amongst piles of shit is a much more accurate experience of what the Thames would have smelt like on that day. I mean, right here, right now, this is probably about as peaceful as the Thames in this part of London gets. Not a lot of boat activity. I've seen the Uber boat go past a couple of times, but apart from that, not a lot going on. But to witness this, let's say somebody was standing on the bank of the Thames where I am right now, to suddenly see these two boats smash through each other, and then to see hundreds of people spilling into the water. And this is quite a wide section of the Thames as well, so even with the hundreds of people that would have suddenly found themselves over there in the water, from the side you would have still only seen just a mass, almost like seeing a shoal of fish bubbling at the surface, a mass of bodies over in the middle of the river. The horrible thing as well is
for the boats that did attempt to get to the survivors in the water and rescue as many as they could, this was a thick group of clawing, screaming, dying people all clumped together in the middle of the river. And so getting to them, it would have been very, very difficult, because as soon as you went anywhere near that throng of people, you're just as likely to be running over and pushing under people as you are saving people.
Once it became clear that there were no more people to save, the search for the dead began. And as more and more bodies were recovered from the water, they were placed in various different makeshift mortuaries, with the next day a lot of the victims being laid out in Woolwich dockyard. And as relatives and friends arrived to identify the dead, it was a heartbreaking scene. And the devastating impact of this disaster on whole families became clear. One man had lost his father, mother, fiancé. Another woman had lost her husband and 7 children. And one of the superintendents of the London Steamboat Company had lost his wife and 4 children, but remained working all the way through the recovery efforts. And it couldn't help but be noticed that a huge number of the dead were women and children. And apparently, one of the saddest sights was the huge number of tiny babies lying amongst the dead, yet to be claimed by any family.
And as you can imagine, not everyone was immediately recovered from the water. Many of the victims who weren't immediately recovered were of course carried with the currents. And in the following days and weeks, bodies were washing up at the side of the Thames from Limehouse to Erith.
In the days that followed, divers were sent down to the 2 sections of the Princess Alice, and what they found was telling of the absolutely horrible scenes of these poor people in their last moments. It seemed that most of the men had tried to fight their way out, with women and children being hampered in the stampede that took place, with most of them lying huddled and crushed on the floors of the 2 saloon decks, or jammed into the doorways in a desperate attempt to follow the men. A diver also reported that many of the passengers still jammed below decks were still upright, with the sheer number of people squeezed in there meaning people had died where they stood. Ultimately, only 2 people who had been below deck survived. And of the huge number of people who were thought to have been aboard, only 130 people were rescued, with many dying later on thanks to ingesting the polluted water. The body of Captain Grinstead was one of those recovered from the water in the days that followed. And the conditions for those searching for bodies were horrifying. If it's not awful enough having to recover bodies from water, the amount of sewage and pollution in the Thames meant that the bodies were covered with slime, and decomposition began a lot faster than it normally would. As bad as the Thames can be, it had rarely been as bad as it was after this disaster.
Now, it's difficult to find any exact numbers, but as far as we can tell, or as best as we can tell, between 600 and 700 of the passengers aboard the Princess Alice lost their lives.
Which makes it still, to this day, the largest loss of life on any UK inland waterway. In the inquest that followed afterwards, the coroner, Charles Carter, and a jury concluded that both vessels had been partly at fault. On the 6th of September, work began to try and raise the wreck of the Princess Alice, and the foresection was beached at low tide at Woolwich. And this brought about its own small amount of chaos, as huge crowds tried to visit Woolwich to see what they could of the Princess Alice, eventually resulting in 250 policemen being drafted in to try and help bring some kind of law and order to the crowds. Then, later that same evening, the aft section of the ship was raised and beached next to the bow. Now, media attention in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe had all been strongly leaning towards the Bywell Castle being in the wrong, and you can see how public sentiment would have leaned that way. It's just natural human nature to blame the large corporate cargo ship and not the Princess Alice and its incredible number of innocent victims. And in the investigation, a lot of witnesses who were familiar with that section of the Thames were called. It was found that most pleasure craft following the same course that the Princess Alice did would head for the northern bank of the Thames as they rounded Tripcock Point to find the more favourable currents. Instead, witnesses stated that the Princess Alice had been on this course but been pushed back into the centre of the river. She had then apparently tried to turn to port to get closer to the river's southern bank, and that was the point at which she ran across the Bywell Castle. The Princess Alice's chief mate, however, denied that the ship had altered course. There was then a small spanner in the works when the stoker from the Bywell Castle, George Purcell, had told several people that the captain and crew were drunk, though this was pretty quickly changed under oath when he said that he had no recollection of claiming that anyone was drunk. And then a large number of other witnesses came forward to say that it was usually Purcell who was drunk. The inquest's final conclusion, focusing on the first person to be recovered from the water as an example for all the other victims, was as follows.
That the death of said William Beechey and others was occasioned by drowning in the waters of the River Thames, from a collision that occurred after sunset between a steam vessel called the Bywell Castle and a steam vessel called the Princess Alice, whereby the Princess Alice was cut in two and sunk, such collision not being wilful, that the Bywell Castle did not take the necessary precaution of easing, stopping, and reversing her engines in time, and that the Princess Alice contributed to the collision by not stopping and going astern. That all collisions, in the opinion of the jury, might in future be avoided if proper and stringent rules and regulations were laid down for all steam navigation on the River Thames.
They also added several other points where they concluded that the Princess Alice had been seaworthy, but was not properly or sufficiently manned. They also concluded that the number of people aboard the Princess Alice was way too many, or more than prudent. And their final conclusion was any life-saving means aboard the Princess Alice were insufficient for a vessel of her class. The Board of Trade inquiry that was running at the same time came to a slightly more one-sided conclusion. They found that the Princess Alice had breached one of the rules of their regulations, which stated that if two ships are heading towards each other, they should both pass on the port side of the other. As stated by many of the witnesses, the Princess Alice had not followed this procedure, and therefore the Princess Alice was to blame, as the Bywell Castle could not have avoided the collision. As for consequences and improvements that came about because of this tragedy, there were a few. During the 1880s, efforts were made to try and purify sewage rather than just dumping it all into the river, and a series of sludge boats were ordered to take it to the North Sea instead of the Thames. And actually, this practice of dumping sewage at sea continued right up until 1998. Also, right up until the Princess Alice disaster, the Marine Police Force had been using rowboats, and the inquest also found that these were just not sufficient for doing the job. And in the mid-1880s, there were 2 steam launches created for the use of the service. As for the Bywell Castle, it was generally undamaged by what had happened, and continued to work, right up until the 29th of January 1883, when, as it was sailing between Alexandria and Hull, it disappeared. The weather had been particularly bad at the time, and it is thought that she sank during a storm, and several 1883 newspapers printed this final report.
It is believed that the steamer Bywell Castle, which ran down the saloon boat Princess Alice off Woolwich some years ago, has been lost in the Bay of Biscay, in the gale which proved fatal to the Kenmure Castle. The Bywell Castle carried a crew of 40 men.
It seems both vessels were somewhat doomed. Now, I am actually currently busy editing this video, but I had to make a little aside, because as often happens while I'm editing and I thought I've got all the information I needed, I'll often find something else that's incredibly interesting. And in this case, it's the connection between the Princess Alice disaster and Jack the Ripper. Now, after the disaster, because of the sheer number of just unidentified victims of this, there were a fair few false claims for, support and compensation from people just trying to kind of chance it. People who were like, oh yeah, my mum was on there. she's probably one of the unidentified bodies. Give me some money. And shortly after the sinking, a woman called Elizabeth Stride approached the clerk of the Swedish church, claiming that she'd lost her husband and 2 children whilst escaping herself. Now, for those of you who aren't up on your 1880s London true crime, Elizabeth Stride was the 3rd victim of Jack the Ripper. And when she made this claim, apparently she looked a little worse for wear, but the church believed her, and she received occasional financial support from them. But with where we currently are in terms of Jack the Ripper research, we know that this really probably wasn't true. Because we're pretty sure that A, Liz's husband was still alive, John Stride was still alive and actually died in 1884, and there is no evidence that she ever had any children. And on top of that, there are no records of her or John or any children related to her being on the Princess Alice. You know, things could have got lost in the mix. There's no completely ruling it out. But it seems like a long shot. And the far more likely case is that Long Liz was just trying to get some money. So, just a fascinating little connection between 2 of London's darkest periods of time. You now find me in Woolwich Old Cemetery, which is where, in 1880, 2 years later, a memorial to the victims of the Princess Alice disaster was erected. And 120 of the victims who were not identified are buried in rows behind the memorial. Alright, as you can probably hear, I'm very much competing with the groundskeepers cutting the grass here today. Yeah, it's nice to see them cutting the grass. And here behind me is the huge memorial that was erected. And it actually claims on the memorial itself that it was paid for by 23,000 people. Just a sign of the huge impact this disaster had. And of course it did. Over 600 people lost their lives. That's entire families. There must have been so many people that either knew someone or knew someone who'd known someone involved in this tragedy. And of course, for the huge number of people who weren't rescued immediately from the water, it would have been incredibly hard to identify them. And in some cases, when you've lost entire families in one go, maybe there's nobody left to identify them. It's just so tragic to think of 120 people, men, women, children, who were just here. We'll never know for sure who they were, what they meant to people, but this is where they ended up. It just shows you the horror of tragedies where this number of people are involved and this number of people die, and especially during this period of time, it's just so easy for people to get lost in the mix. Along with the memorial and the unmarked graves, there is one more grave here of interest. This in front of me here is the unassuming grave of William Grinstead, captain of the Princess Alice. Grinstead's grave is actually placed further down the hill from the memorial. It's actually kind of looking up at the memorial. There's something quite foreboding about the captain of the Princess Alice. Whether in truth he was in any way responsible for what happened or not, there's something quite foreboding about him almost being in the shadow of the memorial to the victims of this tragedy. Well, from Woolwich Old Cemetery, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. This is obviously a vast number of people who were lost. It always seems when a boat goes down, usually vast numbers are involved. These are just awful, awful tragedies. I hope you enjoyed it as much as you possibly could. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more videos like this. That really helps me out. And I'll see you in the next one.